They threw her and her newborn triplets out into the cold, called her babies a burden. Her husband stood there and said nothing. His mother smiled as they closed the door. What they didn't know was that the quiet woman they just destroyed owned everything. The mansion they lived in, the cars they drove, the company that paid for it all. Built by her, controlled by her. And when she decided to take it back, what she did to them was so brutal, so calculated, that by the time they realized who she really was, it was already too late. Before we continue, I need to be honest with you. If this story moves you, if you're already feeling something, but you scroll past without subscribing, YouTube buries it. Stories like hers don't get told. Justice doesn't get seen. And I know that's not what you want. So right now, hit that subscribe button. Show YouTube that women like her matter. And drop a comment with the time where you're watching from. Let's build a community that stands for what's right. Can you do that? Good. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the grand entrance of the Langston estate, her wedding gown flowing like silk against the marble floors. The dress was simple, elegant, nothing extravagant, but she wore it with a dignity that made heads turn. Her hands were steady, her smile calm, but beneath that composed exterior, her heart pounded with a quiet tension she had learned to hide well. She had known from the very first moment she met Damien's family that they saw her as beneath them. It wasn't just in their words, it was in their eyes, the way they looked past her like she was a shadow in their gleaming world of privilege. Victoria Langston, her mother-in-law, had perfected the art of cruelty disguised as politeness. Every compliment was laced with poison, every smile sharp enough to cut. Damien's sisters were no better, whispering behind jeweled hands, their laughter echoing through hallways Eleanor was never meant to walk. But she endured it all, silent and composed, because she believed that love, patience, and time would eventually soften their hearts. She believed that marriage would be her refuge, that Damien's affection would shield her from the storm his family brought. She was wrong. The rehearsal dinner that evening should have been a celebration, a moment of joy before the ceremony. Instead, it became the first battlefield. The dining room glittered with crystal chandeliers and gold-trimmed china, a display of wealth meant to remind Eleanor exactly where she stood. Victoria sat at the head of a table, her posture regal, her gaze cold as ice. She raised her wine glass with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "To Eleanor," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "A woman of such ordinary charm. We're so fortunate our son chose someone so grounded." The table erupted in polite laughter, but Eleanor heard the mockery beneath it. She kept her expression neutral, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Damien squeezed her hand under the table, a gesture meant to comfort, but it felt more like an apology he wasn't brave enough to speak aloud. Victoria continued, her tone sharpening. "Tell me, Eleanor, what was it like growing up without all of this?" She gestured to the opulent room, the servants hovering in the corners, the excess that defined their lives. "It must be quite an adjustment for you." Eleanor met her gaze without flinching. "I grew up learning the value of things that money can't buy," she said quietly. "Respect, integrity, kindness." The words hung in the air, a quiet challenge that Victoria didn't miss. Her smile froze, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "How quaint," she replied, her voice like a blade wrapped in velvet. Then, in a move so deliberate it could only have been planned, Victoria reached for her wine glass and tipped it forward. The deep red liquid spilled across the table, splashing onto Eleanor's pristine white gown. Gasps filled the room, followed by a wave of laughter that felt rehearsed, as if everyone had been waiting for this moment. Eleanor looked down at the stains spreading across her dress, the fabric ruined, the humiliation complete. Her breath caught, but she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stood, her movements slow and controlled, and met Victoria's eyes with a look so calm, so unshakable, that for just a second, the laughter faltered. "Accidents happen," Eleanor said softly, her voice steady. Victoria's smile widened, triumphant. "Indeed they do." But Eleanor didn't miss the flicker of something else in the older woman's eyes, something uneasy, as if she had just glimpsed a shadow she didn't fully understand. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced conversations and thinly veiled insults. Damien apologized repeatedly, his voice full of frustration and embarrassment, but Eleanor barely heard him. Her mind was somewhere else, cataloging every slight, every smirk, every whispered comment. She wasn't just enduring anymore. She was recording, watching, waiting. Because Eleanor Whitmore carried a secret that none of them could imagine. Beneath the quiet exterior, beneath the modest background they mocked so freely, was a woman who controlled an empire. She was the billionaire CEO of Whitmore Enterprises, the very company that funded the Langstons' lavish lifestyle. Every luxury they flaunted, every privilege they assumed was theirs by right, existed because of her. She had kept her identity hidden, hoping for something real, something genuine. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not for what she owned. But as she stood in that dining room, wine staining her dress, laughter ringing in her ears, Eleanor realized that hope had been a mistake. Damien had tried to protect her at first. In the early days, he had defended her, gently redirecting his mother's cruelty, whispering reassurances when his sister's mockery became too sharp. But even then, Eleanor could see the cracks forming. His protection was conditional, fragile, and it wouldn't last. She didn't blame him entirely. Victoria was a master manipulator, and Damien had been under her influence his entire life. Still, Eleanor had hoped he would be strong enough to choose her over them. That hope, too, was fading. As the night wore on and the guests finally began to leave, Eleanor excused herself and walked to the estate's garden. The air was cool, the sky clear, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself to breathe. She looked up at the stars, her mind racing, her heart heavy. She thought about the life she had built in secret, the empire she had created with intelligence, strategy, and relentless determination. She thought about the power she held, power that could crush the Langstons with a single decision. But she wasn't ready to use it yet. Not yet. Victoria's voice cut through the silence. Enjoying the view? Eleanor turned to find her mother-in-law standing a few feet away, her expression smug. "I wanted to speak with you privately," Victoria continued, stepping closer. "I think we both know this marriage is a mistake. You're not one of us, Eleanor. You never will be. My son deserves better." Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice calm. "Better than a woman who loves him?" Victoria laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "Love? How naive. Love doesn't build legacies. Bloodlines do. Status does. You're a lovely girl, I'm sure, but you're not what this family needs." Eleanor held her gaze, unflinching. "And what does this family need, Victoria?" The older woman smiled, her eyes glittering with malice. "Someone who knows her place." Eleanor didn't respond. She simply turned and walked back toward the house, her steps measured, her mind already 10 steps ahead. Victoria had just made a fatal mistake. She had underestimated her. They all had. And one day, very soon, they would realize that the quiet woman they mocked, the humble bride they dismissed, was the one who held all the power. Eleanor Whitmore wasn't just enduring their cruelty. She was building a case, preparing a plan. And when the time came, her revenge would be silent, precise, and absolutely devastating. That night, as she lay beside Damien in their bridal suite, Eleanor stared at the ceiling, her mind alive with strategy. She had been patient for so long. She could be patient a little longer. But make no mistake, the quiet bride they humiliated tonight would one day become the force that destroyed them all. The first 3 months of marriage felt like living in two different worlds. In private, Damien was the man Eleanor had fallen in love with, tender and attentive. His arms a refuge from the storm his family created. He would hold her at night, whispering promises that everything would get better, that his mother would eventually soften, that his sisters would come around. Eleanor wanted to believe him. She clung to those moments, those quiet reassurances, because they were the only proof that marrying him hadn't been a mistake. But even then, she could feel the shift beginning, a slow erosion of the man she thought she knew. It started with small things. Damien would come home late from dinners with his mother, his mood darker, his words sharper. He stopped defending her in front of his family, his silence becoming a new kind of betrayal. When Victoria made cutting remarks at Sunday brunches, Damien would look away, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. When his sisters laughed at Eleanor's simple clothing choices, he would change the subject instead of shutting them down. Eleanor noticed everything. She always did. And with each passing week, the distance between them grew wider. One evening, Eleanor stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, something she enjoyed despite the staff insisting they handle it. Damien walked in, loosening his tie, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to cook," he said flatly. "We have people for that." Eleanor glanced at him, stirring the pot on the stove. "I like cooking. It reminds me of home." Damien's face hardened. "This is your home now. You should act like it." The words stung more than he probably intended. Eleanor set down the spoon, turning to face him. "What's that supposed to mean?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It means you need to stop clinging to your past. You're a Langston now. My mother thinks you're not even trying to fit in." There it was, Victoria's voice coming out of her husband's mouth. Eleanor's chest tightened, but she kept her tone calm. "I'm trying, Damien. But fitting in shouldn't mean losing who I am." He looked at her, frustration flashing in his eyes. "Maybe that's the problem. Maybe who you are isn't enough for this family." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor stared at him, her heart breaking in slow motion, but she didn't let it show. She simply nodded, turned back to the stove, and finished cooking in silence. Damien left the kitchen without another word. That night marked the beginning of his full transformation. What Eleanor didn't know was that Victoria had been working on him for months, planting seeds of doubt, feeding his insecurities, and twisting his perception of reality. She would sit with him in her study, pouring expensive whiskey, her voice smooth and calculated. "She's not one of us, Damien," Victoria would say, her tone sympathetic but poisonous. "I see the way she looks at you, like you're her savior. That's not love, that's dependence. You deserve someone who matches your status, someone who elevates you, not drags you down." Damien would argue at first, defending Eleanor, insisting his mother was wrong. But Victoria was patient. She knew how to manipulate her son, how to make him question his own judgment. She framed Eleanor's kindness as weakness, her humility as inadequacy, her silence as proof that she didn't belong. And slowly, painfully, Damien began to believe it. By the 5th month of marriage, Damien had changed completely. He was cold, distant, and increasingly cruel. He would ignore Eleanor for days, spending his evenings at his mother's estate or out with friends Eleanor had never met. When he did come home, he reeked of perfume that wasn't hers, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes empty. Eleanor confronted him once. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. Damien barely looked at her. "Out. Does it matter?" "Yes, it matters. You're my husband." He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "And you're my wife. But my mother's right. You don't belong here. You never did." Eleanor felt the words like a knife to the chest, but she didn't cry. Not in front of him. She simply walked away, retreating to the bedroom they no longer shared. What Damien didn't see was the way Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking, her mind racing. She wasn't crying because she was weak. She was processing, calculating, recording every word, every betrayal, every act of cruelty. She was building a case, not for a courtroom, but for something far more devastating. Then came the night that shattered what little remained of Eleanor's hope. She had been feeling unwell for weeks, exhausted and nauseous, and when she finally saw a doctor, the news was life-changing. She was pregnant, not just with one child, but with triplets. Eleanor's first emotion was joy, a fleeting, fragile happiness that maybe, just maybe, this would bring them back together. She imagined telling Damien, seeing his face light up, feeling his arms around her again. But when she told him, his reaction was nothing like she had imagined. They were in the living room, the fire crackling in the background, and Eleanor took a deep breath before speaking. "Damien, I have something to tell you. I'm pregnant. We're having triplets." He stared at her, his expression blank. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "This is a mistake." Eleanor's heart stopped. "What?" "You heard me," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "This is the last thing we need right now. 3 kids? Do you have any idea what that's going to do to my life?" Eleanor felt the room tilt. "Your life? Damien, these are our children." He stood, grabbing his jacket. "I need to talk to my mother." And just like that, he left. Eleanor stood there alone, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach, protecting the lives growing inside her. She realized then that the man she married was gone. Whatever Victoria had done to him, it was complete. And as the months of her pregnancy passed, things only got worse. Victoria encouraged Damien to bring other women into their home, framing it as harmless, as something powerful men did. And Damien, weak and manipulated, complied. Eleanor would hear laughter from the guest room, see unfamiliar women leaving in the early morning, their eyes avoiding hers. The humiliation was constant, deliberate, and designed to break her. But Eleanor didn't break. She endured. Every insult, every affair, every moment of cruelty, she absorbed and stored away. She watched Damien become a stranger, a puppet controlled by his mother's strings, and she understood that love alone couldn't save him. He had chosen his family over her, cruelty over compassion, and there was no coming back from that. By the time Eleanor was 8 months pregnant, barely able to move without discomfort, Damien had stopped pretending entirely. He stayed at his mother's estate most nights, and when he did come home, he treated Eleanor like she was invisible. Victoria would visit, her eyes sweeping over Eleanor's swollen belly with disdain. "You've gotten so large," she would say with a false smile. "I do hope those children don't inherit your ordinariness." Eleanor would smile back, calm and composed, even as rage simmered beneath the surface. She had learned that silence wasn't submission. It was a strategy. Every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every act of betrayal, she recorded in her mind like evidence in a case she would one day present. And when the time came, when she had regained her strength and reclaimed her power, the Langstons would realize that the quiet woman they tormented was the most dangerous person they had ever underestimated. Damien's transformation was complete, but so was Eleanor's resolve. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by a coward who had chosen cruelty over courage. And Eleanor Whitmore, quiet and patient, was preparing for the moment when she would make them all pay. The labor pains started in the middle of the night, sharp and unrelenting, tearing through Eleanor's body like fire. She gasped, clutching her swollen belly, her breath coming in short, desperate bursts. The nursery she had carefully prepared sat empty down the hall, waiting for the 3 lives about to enter the world. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling, and called Damien. It rang once, twice, 3 times before he answered, his voice groggy and irritated. "What is it, Eleanor?" "The babies," she whispered, her voice strained with pain. "They're coming. I need you." There was a pause, long enough to make her heart sink. "I'll call my mother," he said flatly. "She'll know what to do." The line went dead. Eleanor stared at the phone in disbelief, tears burning her eyes. But there was no time to process the rejection. Another contraction ripped through her, and she knew she had to move. She called for an ambulance herself, her voice shaking as she gave the address, and within minutes, she was being rushed to the hospital alone. The delivery was brutal. Hours of agony, her body pushed beyond its limits, as she brought 3 tiny, perfect lives into the world. The nurses cooed over the triplets, 2 boys and a girl, their cries filling the sterile room with sound that should have been joyful. But Eleanor's joy was muted, overshadowed by the crushing weight of abandonment. Damien never came. Victoria never came. No one from the Langston family showed up to witness the birth of their own blood. Eleanor held her babies close, tears streaming down her face, whispering promises to them that she would protect them, that they would never feel the rejection she felt in that moment. But even as she made those promises, a dark cloud was forming, one she couldn't have anticipated. 2 days later, as Eleanor sat in her hospital bed nursing one of the babies, the door to her room swung open. Victoria Langston walked in, her expression cold and devoid of any warmth. Behind her, Damien followed, his face unreadable. Eleanor's heart clenched, a mixture of hope and dread flooding her chest. "You came," she said softly, her voice fragile. Victoria's eyes swept over the room, landing on the 3 bassinets where the triplets slept. Her lip curled in disgust. "3 of them," she said, her tone dripping with contempt. "How excessive." Eleanor's grip tightened on the baby in her arms. "They're your grandchildren, Victoria. Your son's children." Victoria laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed off the walls. "My son's burden, you mean? Do you have any idea what you've done? 3 mouths to feed, 3 lives to manage, 3 constant reminders of a marriage that never should have happened." Damien said nothing, standing behind his mother like a shadow, his silence more damning than any words. Eleanor looked at him, searching his face for any sign of the man she had once loved. But there was nothing. Just emptiness. "Damien," Eleanor pleaded, her voice breaking. "Say something. These are our children. Our family." He finally met her eyes, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. "My mother's right," he said quietly. "This was a mistake. All of it." Victoria stepped closer, her presence suffocating. "You're holding him back, Eleanor. You and these children. My son has a legacy to uphold, a future to build, and you are nothing but dead weight dragging him down." Eleanor's hands trembled, her breath catching in her throat. "What are you saying?" Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. "I'm saying you need to leave. Tonight. Pack your things, take your babies, and go back to wherever you came from. You don't belong here. You never did." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She looked at Damien, desperate for him to intervene, to stand up for her, to be the man he had promised to be. But he just stood there, silent, complicit. And in that moment, Eleanor understood that he was lost to her forever. "You can't be serious," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just gave birth. These babies need care, stability. You can't just throw us out." Victoria's eyes hardened. "Watch me." Within an hour, Eleanor found herself being escorted out of the hospital by security, her belongings hastily packed into a single bag. The triplets were bundled in blankets, too young to understand the cruelty being inflicted upon them, their tiny bodies warm against Eleanor's chest as she cradled them. The night air was cold, biting through her thin jacket, the wind whipping around her as she stood on the curb, disoriented and shaking. Damien had arranged for a car to drop her off at a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of town, far from the Langston estate, far from the life she had briefly believed was hers. As the car pulled away, leaving her alone in the dimly lit parking lot, Eleanor felt the full weight of her reality crash down on her. She was alone, cast out, humiliated. Her body still ached from childbirth, her breasts swollen and painful, her legs barely able to hold her weight. The babies stirred in her arms, their soft cries cutting through the silence, and Eleanor felt a surge of fierce, protective love that overpowered everything else. She made her way into the motel room, a cramped, dingy space that smelled of mildew and neglect. She laid the babies down on the bed, making sure they were safe, before collapsing onto the floor, her body giving out. For the first time since the wedding, Eleanor allowed herself to break. She sobbed, her cries raw and guttural, the sound of a woman who had given everything and been left with nothing. But even as the tears fell, even as her body shook with grief and exhaustion, something else was building inside her. Rage. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, calculated fury that sharpens the mind and hardens the heart. Eleanor Whitmore had endured humiliation, betrayal, and abandonment. She had been mocked, scorned, and cast aside like she was nothing. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated her. They had forgotten, or perhaps never known, that the quiet woman they dismissed was a billionaire CEO, the owner of Whitmore Enterprises, the very company that funded every luxury the Langstons enjoyed. Every car, every mansion, every designer gown Victoria wore. All of it was built on the empire Eleanor had created. And now, they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Eleanor wiped her tears, her hand steady as she picked up her phone. She scrolled through her contacts, her mind already working, already planning. She had allies, powerful ones, people who owed her favors, people who respected her intelligence and her authority. She had lawyers, accountants, and board members who would move mountains at her command. The Langstons had thrown her out, believing they had won. But they had no idea what was coming. Eleanor looked at her sleeping babies, their tiny faces peaceful and innocent, and she made a silent vow. She would rise. She would reclaim everything they had stolen from her. And she would make sure that the family who had humiliated her, who had cast her and her children into the cold, would pay for every single moment of cruelty they had inflicted. The night that was meant to break her became the night she was reborn. Eleanor Whitmore was no longer the quiet bride who endured in silence. She was a force, a storm, a reckoning waiting to be unleashed. And when the Langstons finally realized who she truly was, it would already be too late. The question wasn't if they would fall. It was how far, how fast, and how completely. And Eleanor, patient and precise, was ready to show them exactly what happens when you underestimate the wrong woman. Eleanor spent 3 weeks in that motel room, healing her body and sharpening her mind. The triplets became her anchor, their constant needs forcing her to stay present, to stay focused, to push through the pain that threatened to consume her. She fed them, changed them, rocked them to sleep in the quiet hours of the night when the weight of everything felt unbearable. But even in those moments of exhaustion, her mind never stopped working. She made lists, drew diagrams, mapped out strategies with the precision of a military general preparing for war. The Langstons had made their move, and now it was her turn. On the 21st day, Eleanor made her first call. She dialed a number she knew by heart, one that connected her to Marcus Holloway, her most trusted advisor and the chief operating officer of Whitmore Enterprises. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Eleanor, where have you been?" "We've been worried sick. You disappeared without a word, and the board has been asking questions." Eleanor's voice was calm, steady, stripped of any emotion that might reveal her pain. "I needed time, Marcus. But I'm ready now. I need you to arrange a secure meeting with the executive board. Tomorrow. No delays." There was a pause on the other end, Marcus picking up on the shift in her tone. "What's going on, Eleanor?" "Everything," she said quietly. "And I need your absolute loyalty. Can I count on you?" "Always," Marcus replied without hesitation. "I'll make the arrangements." "But Eleanor, are you okay?" She closed her eyes, the question cutting deeper than he could know. "I will be. Soon." The next day, Eleanor walked into the boardroom of Whitmore Enterprises for the first time in months. She wore a tailored black suit, her hair pulled back, her expression unreadable. The triplets were with a trusted nanny she had hired, someone vetted and loyal, someone who understood the need for discretion. The board members stood as she entered, surprise and relief evident on their faces. These were people who respected her, who had watched her build the company from the ground up, who knew her brilliance and her ruthlessness in business. Marcus stepped forward, concern etched into his features. "Eleanor, we didn't know where you were. Are you all right?" She nodded, taking her seat at the head of the table. "I'm fine. But we have work to do, and it starts now." Eleanor laid out her plan with surgical precision. She pulled up financial records, corporate structures, and legal documents that detailed every asset, every account, every privilege the Langston family had access to through their connection to Whitmore Enterprises. The board listened in stunned silence as she explained how the Langstons had built their entire lifestyle on the foundation of her company, benefiting from executive positions they hadn't earned, drawing salaries they didn't deserve, living in properties owned by subsidiaries she controlled. "Richard Langston holds a director position in our European division," Eleanor said, her voice cold and factual. "A position he was given as a courtesy when I married his son. He has contributed nothing of value, yet he draws a 7-figure salary annually. That ends today." One of the board members, an older woman named Catherine, leaned forward. "Eleanor, are you sure about this? Cutting ties with the Langstons could create legal complications, public scrutiny. It could get messy." Eleanor's eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. "It's already messy, Catherine. They threw me and my newborn children out onto the street. They humiliated me, abused me, and believed they could do so without consequences because they assumed I was powerless. They were wrong. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. Marcus spoke next, his voice steady. "What do you need from us?" Eleanor pulled up a document on the screen, a restructuring plan she had drafted in the motel room between feedings and sleepless nights. "I need every position held by a Langston family member terminated immediately. I need all corporate benefits, housing allowances, and discretionary funds frozen. I need our legal team to review every contract, every agreement, and find every loophole that allows us to sever ties cleanly and permanently." Another board member, a younger man named David, raised his hand tentatively. "What about Damien? He's still your husband legally. Won't this complicate things?" Eleanor's jaw tightened. Damien made his choice. He stood by while his family destroyed me. Whatever legal complications arise, I'll handle them. But he will not benefit from my company any longer. None of them will. Catherine nodded slowly, respect flickering in her eyes. "Then we're with you. Let's do this right." Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor orchestrated the dismantling of the Langstons' financial security with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. Every move was legal, documented, and irreversible. Richard Langston received his termination notice via email on a Tuesday morning. He had been sitting in his office, feet up on the desk, scrolling through his phone when the message appeared. He read it once, then twice, his face turning red with confusion and rage. He immediately called his assistant. "Get me Marcus Holloway on the phone. Now." The assistant returned minutes later, her voice hesitant. "Mr. Holloway says all inquiries should be directed to the legal department." Richard's hands slammed onto the desk. What the hell is going on? But no one had answers. His access to company accounts was revoked, his corporate credit cards declined, his security clearance to the office building disabled. Within hours, he realized he had been completely cut off, and panic set in. He called Damien, his voice frantic. "Your wife, she's done something. I don't know how, but she's locked me out of everything. Call her. Fix this." Damien, sitting in his mother's living room, scoffed. "Eleanor doesn't have that kind of power, Dad. You're overreacting." Richard's voice rose to a shout. "I'm telling you, something is very wrong. Get to the bottom of this." But Damien didn't take it seriously. None of them did. They assumed it was a clerical error, a bureaucratic mistake that would be corrected with a few phone calls. They had no idea that Eleanor was just getting started. Victoria received her notice next, a formal letter delivered by courier to the Langston estate. It informed her that the property she lived in, a sprawling mansion she had assumed was family-owned, was actually held by a subsidiary of Whitmore Enterprises. Her lease, extended as a courtesy, was being terminated effective immediately. She had 30 days to vacate. Victoria read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking with fury. "This is absurd," she hissed, crumpling the paper. "Who do they think they're dealing with?" She called her lawyer, demanding action, but the response she received chilled her to the bone. "Mrs. Langston, the property is legally owned by Whitmore Enterprises. The termination is within their rights. There's nothing we can do." Victoria's voice turned shrill. "Whitmore Enterprises. What does some random company have to do with us?" The lawyer hesitated. "Mrs. Langston, you might want to look into who owns Whitmore Enterprises." When Victoria discovered the truth, the color drained from her face. Eleanor sat in her new penthouse apartment, a sleek, modern space she had purchased under a private trust, far from the Langston estate and the motel that had sheltered her darkest days. The triplets were asleep in their nursery, monitors softly transmitting their peaceful breathing. She poured herself a glass of wine, her first in months, and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Her phone buzzed with updates from Marcus. Richard's accounts had been fully frozen. Victoria's eviction notice had been served. Damien's trust fund, which he had believed was family money, had been revealed as a discretionary account funded entirely by Whitmore Enterprises, and it was now closed. Every move Eleanor made sent shockwaves through the Langston family, and the best part was that they still didn't understand the full scope of what was happening. They were scrambling, panicking, trying to fix problems they didn't even comprehend. Eleanor's phone rang, and she saw Damien's name flash across the screen. She let it ring twice before answering, her voice calm and detached. Yes. Damien's voice was strained, desperate. Eleanor, what's going on? My father's been fired, my mother's being evicted, and my accounts are frozen. Do you know anything about this? Eleanor took a slow sip of wine, savoring the moment. I know everything about it, Damien. Because I'm the one who did it. There was a long, stunned silence. What are you talking about? Whitmore Enterprises, Eleanor said, her voice like ice. The company your entire family has been living off of for years. It's mine. I built it. I own it. And I've decided that the Langstons no longer deserve to benefit from my success. Damien's breath hitched. You're lying. That's impossible. Is it? Eleanor's tone was sharp, cutting. Check the records. Ask your lawyers. Look at the board. You'll see my name everywhere, Damien. I've been hiding in plain sight, and you are all too arrogant to notice. His voice cracked, panic seeping through. Eleanor, please. We can fix this. We can talk. Just stop whatever you're doing. Eleanor's laugh was soft, bitter. Fix this? The way you fixed our marriage? The way your mother fixed my wedding day? The way your family fixed the night you threw me and our newborn babies into the street? Damien stammered, searching for words. I'm sorry. I made mistakes. But this isn't the answer. You're right, Eleanor said coldly. This isn't the answer. This is justice. She ended the call, blocking his number immediately. She set the phone down, her hands steady, her heart calm. The first phase of her plan was complete. The Langstons were beginning to understand that the quiet woman they had mocked, the humble bride they had humiliated, was the one who held all the power. And this was only the beginning. Eleanor looked out the window at the city lights below, her reflection staring back at her, strong and unbroken. The Langstons had tried to destroy her, but instead, they had awakened something far more dangerous. A woman who knew her worth. A woman who controlled an empire. A woman who would stop at nothing to reclaim everything they had stolen. And as the city slept below, Eleanor Whitmore smiled, knowing that the family who had cast her aside was about to learn the most painful lesson of their lives. Never underestimate a quiet woman. Because when she finally speaks, the world listens. The invitation arrived at the Langston estate 3 weeks after Eleanor's first wave of financial strikes. It was elegant, printed on cream cardstock with gold lettering, delivered by courier in the early afternoon. Victoria opened it with trembling hands, her face pale from weeks of mounting stress and confusion. The invitation was for the annual Belmont Foundation Charity Gala, the most prestigious social event of the year, where the city's elite gathered to showcase their wealth, influence, and status. Victoria had attended every year for the past 2 decades, using the event as a stage to display the Langston family's supposed superiority. But this year felt different. The invitation included a handwritten note at the bottom that made Victoria's blood run cold. Special keynote address by Eleanor Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Enterprises. Attendance is strongly encouraged. Victoria's hands shook as she read the words again. Eleanor Whitmore, CEO. The truth she had been denying, the reality she had refused to accept, was now staring her in the face. Damien walked into the room, his face drawn and exhausted from sleepless nights spent trying to understand the financial collapse happening around him. What is it? He asked, his voice flat. Victoria handed him the invitation without a word. He read it, his eyes widening with each line. This can't be real, he whispered. It is, Victoria said, her voice barely audible. And we have to go. The night of the gala arrived with the kind of anticipation that makes the air feel electric. The grand ballroom of the Belmont Hotel was a spectacle of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers casting golden light over marble floors, tables draped in silk, and arrangements of white roses that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The city's elite filled the room, their laughter and conversation creating a buzz that hummed beneath the live orchestra playing softly in the background. The Langstons arrived together, a united front that barely concealed the cracks forming beneath the surface. Victoria wore a designer gown, her jewelry meticulously chosen, but her smile was strained, her eyes scanning the room with a nervousness she couldn't hide. Richard stood beside her, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. Damien lingered behind them, his usual confidence replaced with something that looked dangerously close to fear. They took their seats at a table near the front, a position they had always occupied with pride, but tonight it felt like sitting in the spotlight of their own impending doom. The room gradually quieted as the MC took the stage, welcoming the guests and thanking them for their generosity. Then came the moment that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC announced, his voice ringing through the ballroom, "it is my great honor to introduce tonight's keynote speaker. A visionary leader, a self-made billionaire, and the founder and CEO of Whitmore Enterprises. Please welcome Eleanor Whitmore." The applause started before Eleanor even appeared, a polite, expected response from a crowd trained in social decorum. But when she stepped onto the stage, the applause faltered, replaced by a wave of stunned silence that rippled through the room. Eleanor moved with a grace that commanded attention, her presence filling the space in a way that made everyone sit up straighter. She wore a floor-length midnight blue gown that was both elegant and powerful, her hair styled simply, her makeup understated. But it was her eyes that captured the room, calm, confident, and filled with a quiet authority that made even the most arrogant attendees feel small. She reached the podium, paused, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make people uncomfortable. Then she smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent a chill down Victoria's spine. "Good evening," Eleanor began, her voice steady and clear. "Thank you for that warm welcome. It's an honor to be here tonight, surrounded by so many distinguished individuals, people who have built their legacies on hard work, integrity, and a commitment to excellence." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Or at least, that's what we tell ourselves, isn't it?" A murmur of uncertainty spread through the crowd. Eleanor's smile widened slightly. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and I am the founder and CEO of Whitmore Enterprises. Some of you may not be familiar with my company, but I assure you, many of you have benefited from it. We operate in real estate, technology, finance, and corporate infrastructure. We own properties across 3 continents, manage assets worth billions, and provide the foundation for many of the privileges enjoyed by families in this room." Victoria felt her heart pounding in her chest, her face flushing hot with humiliation and rage. She glanced at Damien, whose face had gone deathly pale. Eleanor continued, her tone conversational but laced with steel. "I built Whitmore Enterprises from the ground up. I started with nothing, no family fortune, no connections, no safety net. Just intelligence, determination, and a refusal to accept that my circumstances define my worth. And over the years, I built something extraordinary, something powerful, something that people wanted to be a part of." She paused, her eyes scanning the room, landing briefly on the Langston table before moving on. "But here's the interesting part. When you're a woman, especially a woman who doesn't come from wealth, people underestimate you. They see your kindness as weakness, your humility as ignorance, your patience as submission, and they believe, truly believe, that they can take advantage of you without consequence." The room was silent now, every eye fixed on Eleanor, every breath held in anticipation. "I'm married into a family that believed they were superior to me," Eleanor said, her voice calm but cutting. "A family that mocked my background, humiliated me publicly, and treated me like I was nothing. They didn't know that the company funding their lifestyle, the empire supporting their privileges, belonged to me." Gasps erupted across the ballroom. Heads turned toward the Langston table, where Victoria sat frozen, her face a mask of shock and fury. Damien looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Richard's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Eleanor's voice grew stronger, more commanding. "They believed they could discard me without consequence. After I gave birth to triplets, my husband and his family threw me and my newborn children out onto the street, calling us a burden. They assumed I had nowhere to go, no power, no recourse. They were wrong. The room buzzed with shocked whispers, cameras flashing as reporters and socialites captured every moment. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. Every asset they enjoyed, every privilege they flaunted, every dollar they spent, it all came from the company I built. The estate they lived in? Mine. The cars they drove? Mine. The positions they held? Given as a courtesy, not earned through merit. And now every single one of those privileges has been revoked. Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is slander," she shouted, her voice shrill and desperate. "You have no right to humiliate us like this." Eleanor's eyes locked onto hers, calm and unflinching. "I have every right, Victoria. Because unlike you, I built my power through honesty, hard work, and integrity. You built yours on cruelty, entitlement, and the assumption that no one would ever hold you accountable. Tonight, that changes." The room erupted in applause, not the polite, obligatory kind from before, but a genuine, thunderous response that shook the chandeliers. People stood, clapping and cheering, their respect for Eleanor palpable. The Langstons sat frozen, surrounded by the very people they had once considered peers, now staring at them with a mixture of pity and disdain. Eleanor stepped away from the podium, her speech complete, her message delivered. As she descended the stage, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust toward her, questions shouted from every direction. "Ms. Whitmore, can you confirm the details of your relationship with the Langston family? Is it true they had no idea you owned Whitmore Enterprises? What's your next move?" Eleanor paused, turning to face the cameras with the poise of someone who had prepared for this moment her entire life. "My next move is simple," she said, her voice calm and resolute. "I will continue to build my company, raise my children, and ensure that no one ever mistakes kindness for weakness again. As for the Langstons, they will face the consequences of their actions, both legally and publicly. Justice doesn't require vengeance. It only requires truth." The cameras captured her every word, her image broadcast across news networks and social media within minutes. By the time Eleanor left the gala that night, her story had gone viral, shared millions of times, dissected and discussed in every corner of the internet. The quiet woman who had been humiliated and cast aside had become a symbol of strength, resilience, and the power of patience. Back at the Langston estate, Victoria sat in the darkened living room, the gala invitation crumpled in her hands. Damien paced the floor, his phone buzzing incessantly with calls and messages he couldn't bring himself to answer. Richard stood by the window, staring out at the estate that no longer belonged to them, his empire crumbling around him. "We underestimated her," Richard said quietly, his voice hollow. Victoria's hands trembled. "We destroyed ourselves." And in that moment, as the weight of their actions finally settled on their shoulders, the Langstons understood a truth they had ignored for too long. Eleanor Whitmore was never the weak, insignificant woman they believed her to be. She was the architect of their world, and now she was the force that would tear it down. The gala marked the beginning of the end for the Langstons, but for Eleanor, it was the moment she reclaimed not just her power, but her voice, her dignity, and her place in a world that had tried to silence her. And as the city buzzed with the story of the billionaire CEO who had been hidden in plain sight, one question echoed in the minds of everyone who heard it. How far would Eleanor go to ensure justice was served? The answer, they would soon discover, was farther than anyone could imagine. The morning after the gala, Eleanor sat in her office at Whitmore Enterprises, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Her desk was organized with military precision, documents stacked neatly, her computer displaying financial spreadsheets and legal briefs. She had barely slept, but her mind was sharp, focused, running through every detail of the plan she had spent weeks perfecting. The public exposure at the gala had been the declaration of war. Now came the systematic dismantling of everything the Langstons had built on her foundation. Marcus entered the office carrying a leather portfolio, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "The media is still going crazy," he said, setting the portfolio on her desk. "Your speech is everywhere. Social media, news networks, even international outlets are picking it up. You're trending globally. Eleanor nodded, her face calm. Good. Public opinion matters, but it's not enough. We need to move on the assets now, while they're still reeling. They won't have time to mount a proper defense if we strike fast and hard. Marcus opened the portfolio, revealing a detailed breakdown of every asset connected to the Langston family. The estate is the biggest piece. It's legally owned by a subsidiary of Whitmore Enterprises, held under a trust that was established before your marriage. Richard and Victoria have been living there under what they believed was a family arrangement, but legally, they're tenants at will. Eleanor's eyes scanned the documents, her mind processing every clause, every loophole, every advantage. What's the eviction timeline? 30 days is standard, Marcus replied. But given the public nature of this situation, our lawyers recommend 45 to avoid any accusations of cruelty or unfair treatment. It gives them time to find alternative housing and makes us look reasonable in the court of public opinion. Eleanor considered this, then nodded. 45 days. But not a day more. I want the eviction notice served today, formally and publicly. Make sure every media outlet knows that the Langston estate is being reclaimed by its rightful owner. Marcus made a note. What about the cars? Repossessed, Eleanor said without hesitation. Every vehicle registered under the subsidiary or corporate accounts. They can keep anything they personally own and can prove they paid for themselves, but I doubt there's much. Marcus smiled slightly. There isn't. Most of the luxury cars were leased through corporate accounts as executive perks. We've already frozen those accounts, so the leasing companies are already moving to reclaim them. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her. And the bank accounts? The discretionary funds. Frozen across the board, Marcus confirmed. Richard's personal accounts are minimal. Most of his wealth was tied to his director's salary and bonuses, which have been terminated. Victoria's accounts were funded primarily through allowances from the family trust, which we've dissolved. Damien's trust fund, which he believed was generational wealth, was actually a discretionary account we managed. It's been closed. Eleanor felt a flicker of satisfaction, cold and precise. How much are we talking? Marcus flipped through the documents. Combined, the Langstons had access to approximately $47 million in liquid assets, all of which were tied to Whitmore Enterprises in some capacity. That access is now gone. Their actual personal wealth, excluding the corporate benefits, is less than $2 million. The number hung in the air, a testament to how completely the Langstons had been living off Eleanor's empire, without even realizing it. They thought they were untouchable, Eleanor said quietly. They believed their wealth was theirs by birthright. But it was always mine. Every dollar, every privilege, every moment of luxury they enjoyed, I gave them. And now I'm taking it back. Marcus hesitated, then spoke carefully. Eleanor, I need to ask. Are you sure you want to go this far? This level of public and financial destruction. It's going to be brutal. They'll fight back, legally, socially, maybe even personally. Are you prepared for that? Eleanor's eyes met his, unwavering. They threw me and my newborn babies out into the cold, Marcus. They humiliated me, mocked me, and believed I would disappear quietly. I'm not doing this out of spite. I'm doing this because it's justice. They need to understand that actions have consequences, and that no amount of arrogance or entitlement can protect you when you've built your life on someone else's foundation. Marcus nodded slowly, respect evident in his expression. Then let's finish this. Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor executed her plan with surgical precision. Every move was legal, documented, and irreversible, designed to maximize impact while maintaining her moral high ground. The eviction notice was served to the Langston estate on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a sheriff's deputy and a legal team representing Whitmore Enterprises. Victoria answered the door, still in her robe, her face free of makeup, revealing the exhaustion and stress that had aged her in recent weeks. The deputy handed her the envelope, his expression neutral. Mrs. Langston, you're being served with formal eviction notice. You have 45 days to vacate the premises. Victoria's hands shook as she opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the legal text that confirmed her worst fears. "This is my home," she said, her voice cracking. "I've lived here for 30 years. The deputy's tone was professional but firm. "The property is owned by Whitmore Enterprises. You've been residing here as a tenant at will. The owner has chosen to terminate that arrangement. You have 45 days. Victoria slammed the door, her composure shattering. She stumbled into the living room where Richard and Damien sat, both men looking defeated and hollow. "We have to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's kicking us out. 45 days. Richard stood, his face flushed with impotent rage. "We'll fight this. We'll take her to court, challenge the ownership, tie this up in litigation for years." But even as he spoke, he knew it was pointless. Eleanor's lawyers were the best in the business, and every document, every deed, every legal structure was airtight. The cars were next. On a Thursday afternoon, tow trucks arrived at the estate, professional and efficient, repossessing the fleet of luxury vehicles that had filled the Langston garage. A Mercedes, a Bentley, 2 Range Rovers, and a vintage Porsche that Richard had always claimed was his pride and joy. Victoria watched from the window, tears streaming down her face, as each car was loaded onto a flatbed and driven away. Damien stood beside her, his hands clenched into fists, his voice choked with disbelief. "She's taking everything. Every single thing." Victoria turned to him, her eyes red and swollen. "This is your fault. You let her into this family. You married her. You destroyed us." Damien's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. What could he say? She was right. The financial collapse hit hardest when the bank notices arrived. Richard opened an envelope from his private bank, expecting his usual monthly statement, only to find a letter informing him that his accounts had been flagged for irregularities and subsequently frozen pending investigation. He called the bank immediately, his voice frantic. "What investigation? What are you talking about?" The bank representative's tone was apologetic but firm. "Mr. Langston, our records indicate that a significant portion of your deposits originated from corporate accounts tied to Whitmore Enterprises. Those accounts have been flagged as unauthorized distributions. Until the matter is resolved, your access is suspended." Richard's face turned crimson. "Unauthorized? I worked for that company for 15 years. Sir, our records show your employment was terminated 3 weeks ago. Any funds transferred after that date are being reviewed." Richard hung up, his hands trembling with rage and fear. He had no money, no access, no options. Victoria faced a similar reality when her credit cards were declined at her favorite boutique, a humiliating scene witnessed by other shoppers who whispered and pointed. The saleswoman, someone who had served Victoria for years, looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Langston, there seems to be an issue with your account. Perhaps you have another card." Victoria's face burned with shame as she fumbled through her wallet, trying card after card. Each one declined. She finally left the store empty-handed, tears blurring her vision, the whispers following her out the door. Damien's collapse was slower, but equally devastating. His friends, who had once admired his status and privilege, began to distance themselves. Invitations stopped coming. Phone calls went unreturned. He tried to access his trust fund to maintain some semblance of his lifestyle, only to discover that the account no longer existed. He called the financial institution, his voice desperate. "There has to be a mistake. That account has been active for 20 years. The representative's response was clinical. "Mr. Langston, the account was a discretionary trust managed by Whitmore Enterprises. It was dissolved on their authority. Any remaining funds were transferred back to the primary account holder." "Who's the primary account holder?" Damien demanded, though he already knew the answer. "Eleanor Whitmore, sir." Damien ended the call, staring at his phone in stunned silence. Everything he had believed was his, everything he had taken for granted, had never actually belonged to him. It had all been Eleanor's. While the Langstons scrambled to salvage what little they had left, Eleanor maintained her calm, methodical approach. She didn't gloat, didn't make public statements about the asset reclamation. didn't engage with the media frenzy surrounding her actions. She simply continued with her life, raising her triplets, running her company, and ensuring that every legal step was executed flawlessly. One evening, as Eleanor fed her daughter in the quiet of her penthouse, Marcus called with an update. The estate is almost empty. They've started moving out. Richard hired a lawyer to try and challenge the eviction, but our legal team shut it down within 48 hours. There's no case. Eleanor adjusted the bottle, her voice soft. And the public response? Overwhelmingly in your favor, Marcus said. People are calling you a hero, a symbol of resilience and justice. The Langstons are being torn apart on social media. Articles, opinion pieces, even think pieces about power dynamics and accountability. You've become a cultural moment, Eleanor. She smiled faintly. Good. But Marcus, make sure we're not cruel. I want them to understand consequences, not to be destroyed beyond repair. We take what's ours, we correct the injustice, but we don't become what they were. Marcus's voice was warm. That's why people respect you, Eleanor. You have power, but you have integrity too. That combination is rare. As Eleanor hung up, she looked at her children, their tiny faces peaceful in sleep, and felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in months. The Langstons had tried to erase her, to humiliate her into silence, to make her believe she was nothing. But in their arrogance, they had awakened something far more powerful. A woman who knew her worth. A woman who built empires. A woman who would never again allow anyone to underestimate her. The reclamation of assets wasn't just about money or property. It was about reclaiming dignity, respect, and the truth that had been buried under layers of lies and entitlement. And as the Langstons packed their belongings and prepared to leave the estate that had never truly been theirs, one question lingered in the minds of everyone watching this unfold. How much further would Eleanor go to ensure that justice was fully served? The answer, as the world would soon discover, was as far as it took. Damien Langston had always believed he was untouchable. From the moment he was born into privilege, surrounded by wealth and status, he had moved through life with the careless confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences. He had made mistakes, hurt people, acted with cruelty and entitlement, but none of it had ever cost him anything. Until now. The weeks following Eleanor's public revelation at the gala had been a slow, agonizing descent into a reality Damien couldn't escape. Everything he had taken for granted, every assumption he had made about his place in the world, had been stripped away with surgical precision. And the worst part was knowing that the woman he had discarded, the wife he had humiliated and abandoned, was the architect of his destruction. He sat alone in what used to be his study, a room that had once felt like a sanctuary of power and control, now nearly empty except for a desk and a single chair. The walls, once lined with expensive art and awards he hadn't earned, were bare. The leather furniture had been repossessed. The crystal decanter that had held his favorite whiskey was gone, along with everything else that had made this space feel like his. Damien stared at his laptop, the screen glowing in the dim light, displaying an endless stream of articles, social media posts, and news segments all focused on one story. Eleanor Whitmore, the billionaire CEO who had been hiding in plain sight, the wronged wife who had reclaimed her empire, and him, the villain, the cruel husband who had thrown her and their newborn children into the street. His phone buzzed for what felt like the 100th time that day. He glanced at it, seeing another message from someone he had once considered a friend, someone who now wanted nothing to do with him. The message was short, brutal. Dude, what you did to her is disgusting. Don't contact me again. Damien deleted it without responding, his hands shaking. He had received dozens of similar messages over the past weeks, each one cutting deeper than the last. Friends had abandoned him. Business associates refused his calls. Social invitations that used to flood his inbox had stopped completely. He had become a pariah, and the isolation was suffocating. He thought about calling Eleanor, begging her to stop, to show mercy, to remember the man he used to be before his mother's poison had twisted him into something unrecognizable. But every time he reached for the phone, shame stopped him. What could he possibly say that would undo the damage he had caused? How could he ask for forgiveness when he had shown her none? The door to the study opened, and Victoria walked in, her appearance shocking in its decline. The woman who had once been the queen of high society, impeccably dressed and always in control, now looked gaunt and exhausted. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes wrinkled, her eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. She had aged years in a matter of weeks. "We need to talk," she said, her voice hoarse. Damien looked up, his expression hollow. "What's left to talk about, Mother? She's taken everything. We have nothing." Victoria sat down heavily in the chair across from him, her hands trembling. "We still have options. We can fight back. Hire better lawyers. Go to the press with our side of the story. Make her look like the villain." Damien let out a bitter laugh, the sound devoid of any humor. "Our side of the story? And what exactly is that, Mother? That we humiliated her for months? That you spilled wine on her wedding dress? That I brought other women into our home while she was pregnant? That we threw her and our newborn babies out into the cold?" Victoria's face flushed with anger and shame. "She's exaggerating, making herself out to be some kind of saint. People don't know the full story." "They know enough," Damien said, his voice breaking. "They know we treated her like garbage. They know she was the one with all the power, and we were too arrogant to see it. And now the whole world is watching us pay for it." Victoria's hands clenched into fists. "This is your fault. You're the one who married her. You brought her into this family. If you had just listened to me from the beginning and chosen someone appropriate, none of this would have happened." Damien's eyes snapped to hers, fury igniting in his chest. "My fault? You're the one who poisoned me against her. You spent months telling me she wasn't good enough, that she was holding me back, that I deserved better. You manipulated me, and I was too weak to see it." Victoria stood abruptly, her voice rising. "I was protecting you. Protecting this family. She never belonged here, and you know it. She owned everything we had." Damien shouted, his control finally shattering. "The house, the cars, the money, all of it came from her. We were living off her success while treating her like she was beneath us. And now she's taken it all back because we gave her every reason to." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling between them like a verdict. Victoria's face crumbled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. Damien looked away, his voice barely audible. "I don't know." Over the following days, Damien's mental state deteriorated further. He stopped shaving, stopped eating properly, spending hours staring at his phone, scrolling through articles and social media posts that detailed his downfall. The comment section of every article was brutal. People he had never met tearing him apart, calling him weak, pathetic, a disgrace. And the worst part was that he agreed with them. He tried reaching out to Eleanor multiple times, each attempt more desperate than the last. He sent emails that went unanswered. He left voicemails that were never returned. He even tried showing up at the Whitmore Enterprises building, only to be stopped by security who informed him, politely but firmly, that he was not welcome. One evening, in a moment of desperation, Damien managed to get through to Marcus Holloway, Eleanor's trusted advisor. Marcus answered the call with a tone that was professional but cold. "Mr. Langston, I don't think there's anything we have to discuss." "Please," Damien said, his voice cracking. "I need to speak with Eleanor. Just 5 minutes. I need to explain, apologize, and make things right." Marcus's response was measured, each word deliberate. "Mr. Langston, Eleanor has made it very clear that she has no interest in speaking with you. The only communication she will accept is through legal channels regarding child support for the triplets. Beyond that, you no longer have a place in her life." "I made mistakes," Damien pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "I know I did, but I'm trying to fix them. I'm trying to be better." Marcus's voice softened slightly, but his message remained firm. "Then be better for your children, Mr. Langston. They're the only reason Eleanor hasn't completely severed all ties. You will have access to them, supervised and scheduled, and you'll provide financial support as outlined by the court. But Eleanor? She's moved on. And frankly, after everything you put her through, She deserves to. The line went dead, and Damien sat in the darkness of his empty study, the weight of his failures crushing him. He thought about the man he used to be, the man Eleanor had fallen in love with, and wondered when that person had disappeared. He thought about the night he had stood by while his mother threw Eleanor and the babies out, how he had said nothing, done nothing, allowed it to happen. The memory haunted him, replaying in his mind over and over like a nightmare he couldn't escape. Financial ruin followed emotional collapse. Damien had no job, no income, and no prospects. The positions he had held were revealed to be hollow titles, roles given to him because of his family's connection to Eleanor's company, not because of any skill or merit he possessed. When he tried applying for other positions, his name alone was enough to disqualify him. No one wanted to hire the man who had become a symbol of entitlement and cruelty. He moved out of the estate before the eviction deadline, renting a small, modest apartment on the outskirts of the city with what little money he had left. The space was a stark contrast to the life he had known, cramped and bare, with second-hand furniture and walls that seemed to close in on him. He spent his days in isolation, cut off from the world that had once revolved around him. His mother called occasionally, her voice filled with bitterness and blame, but those conversations only made things worse. His father had stopped speaking to him entirely, the silent disapproval more damning than any words could be. One afternoon, Damien received a formal letter from Eleanor's legal team. It outlined the terms of his access to the triplets, the financial obligations he was required to meet, and the boundaries that had been set. He was allowed supervised visits twice a month, but only under conditions that Eleanor deemed appropriate. The child support payments were calculated based on his current financial situation, which was minimal, but they were still more than he could afford. Damien read the letter 3 times, each word a reminder of how completely he had lost control of his life. He had no power, no influence, no say in the lives of his own children. Eleanor held all the cards, and she had every right to. He thought about the triplets, babies he had barely seen since the night they were born. He had never held them, never fed them, never experienced the simple joy of being their father. And now, because of his own actions, he might never have that chance. The guilt was overwhelming, a constant presence that made it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to exist. He started drinking, not heavily, but enough to dull the pain, to quiet the voices in his head that reminded him of everything he had lost. He would sit in his apartment, a cheap bottle of whiskey on the table, staring at photos on his phone of a life that no longer existed. Photos of himself at parties, surrounded by people who no longer spoke to him. Photos of the estate, the cars, the luxury that had all been a lie. And photos of Eleanor from the early days of their relationship, when she had looked at him with love and hope before he had destroyed it all. One night, in a moment of clarity brought on by exhaustion and too much alcohol, Damien called Eleanor one last time. He didn't expect her to answer, and she didn't. But he left a voicemail, his voice raw and broken. "Eleanor, it's me. I know you don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything I did, for everything I didn't do. You deserve better. You deserved a husband who protected you, who stood up for you, who loved you the way you deserved to be loved. And I failed. I failed you, I failed our children, and I failed myself." He paused, wiping tears from his face. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even deserve to ask. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see what I lost. I see what you were, what you are, and I understand why you're doing this. You're not being cruel. You're being just. And I wish I had been strong enough to see it sooner." He ended the call, setting the phone down, and sat in the silence of his empty apartment. Eleanor never responded to the voicemail. She didn't need to. Damien's collapse was complete, not just financially or socially, but internally. He had been broken down to his core, forced to confront the man he had become and the choices that had led him here. And as he sat alone in the darkness, one question haunted him more than any other. Could a man who had fallen this far ever find a way to rebuild, or was he destined to live in the ruins of his own making? The answer, he was beginning to realize, depended entirely on whether he had the courage to truly change, not for Eleanor, not for his family, but for himself. And that, more than anything, terrified him. Eleanor's campaign extended far beyond boardrooms and legal documents. The dismantling of the Langston family's financial empire was only one dimension of the justice she sought. The other, equally powerful, was the complete collapse of their social credibility, the carefully constructed image of superiority they had spent decades building. In the world they had once dominated, reputation was everything, and Eleanor understood that better than anyone. She had watched them wield social status like a weapon, using it to humiliate, exclude, and control. Now it was time to show them what happened when that weapon turned against its wielder. The first blow came from the press. Eleanor had remained largely silent after the gala, allowing the story to spread organically, but she knew that carefully timed interviews and strategic media appearances would amplify the narrative in ways that served her purpose. She accepted an invitation to appear on City Spotlight, the most watched morning show in the region, hosted by Rebecca Clark, a journalist known for her sharp questions and ability to get to the heart of any story. The interview was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and by the time Eleanor arrived at the studio, the anticipation had reached a fever pitch. Social media was buzzing with speculation about what she would say, what details she would reveal, and how she would handle questions about the Langstons. Eleanor sat across from Rebecca in the brightly lit studio, her posture relaxed but commanding, her expression calm. She wore a simple gray suit, professional and understated, allowing her words and presence to dominate rather than her appearance. Rebecca opened with a warm smile. Eleanor Whitmore, thank you for joining us today. The story of your journey has captivated millions. For those just tuning in, can you tell us, in your own words, what happened? Eleanor nodded, her voice steady and clear. I married into a family that believed they were superior to me because of my background. From the moment I met them, I was treated as if I didn't belong. My wedding day, which should have been one of the happiest moments of my life, became a stage for public humiliation. My mother-in-law spilled wine on my dress deliberately, and the family laughed. That was just the beginning. Rebecca leaned forward, her expression empathetic. And yet you stayed. You endured months of mistreatment. Why? Eleanor's eyes flickered with emotion, but her voice remained controlled. Because I believed in the power of patience and love. I thought that if I proved myself, if I showed them kindness despite their cruelty, they would eventually accept me. I was wrong. Instead, the abuse escalated. My husband, who had initially defended me, was manipulated by his mother until he became cold, unfaithful, and cruel. By the time I gave birth to our triplets, he had completely turned against me. Rebecca's voice dropped, her tone serious. And that's when they expelled you? Eleanor nodded, her jaw tightening. The night I gave birth, my mother-in-law came to the hospital and told me I was holding her son back. She said my children were a burden. Within days, I was thrown out of their home with 3 newborn babies, no support, and nowhere to go. They believed I was powerless, that I would disappear quietly. Rebecca's eyes widened. But they didn't know who you really were. Eleanor's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. No. They had no idea that I was the CEO and founder of Whitmore Enterprises, the company that funded their entire lifestyle. Every privilege they enjoyed, every asset they flaunted, came from the empire I built. And when they discarded me, they lost everything. The interview aired to record viewership, and within hours, clips were circulating across every social media platform. Eleanor's calm, dignified recounting of the abuse she endured, contrasted with the Langstons' arrogance and cruelty, created a narrative so compelling that it dominated conversations for days. Public opinion, already firmly in Eleanor's favor, solidified into something more powerful, a collective moral judgment that the Langstons could not escape. Victoria Langston watched the interview from the small apartment she now shared with Richard, her hands shaking with rage and humiliation. The woman she had once dismissed as insignificant was now being celebrated as a hero, while Victoria had become a symbol of everything people despised: entitlement, cruelty, and the abuse of power. She's lying, Victoria hissed, her voice breaking. She's exaggerating everything to make herself look like a victim. Richard sat in silence, staring at the television screen, his face pale. He didn't respond because he knew Victoria was wrong. Eleanor hadn't exaggerated anything. If anything, she had been merciful, leaving out details that could have made them look even worse. Victoria's phone buzzed with notifications, messages from people she had once considered friends. Women who had shared her social circles, attended her parties, and envied her status. But now, the messages were different. "How could you treat her that way?" one read. "You should be ashamed of yourself," said another. "I always knew you were cruel, but this is beyond disgusting." Victoria threw the phone across the room, tears streaming down her face. The social collapse was swift and merciless. Invitations that had once filled the Langstons' calendar stopped coming entirely. The charity galas, the exclusive dinners, the country club gatherings, all of it evaporated. Doors that had always been open to them were now firmly closed, and the whispers that followed them wherever they went were impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Victoria attempted to visit her favorite boutique, a place where she had spent thousands of dollars over the years and had always been treated like royalty. The moment she walked in, the atmosphere shifted. The sales associates exchanged glances, their smiles forced and uncomfortable. The manager approached, her tone polite but firm. "Mrs. Langston, I'm afraid we're unable to assist you today." Victoria's face flushed. "Excuse me? I've been a loyal customer for over a decade." The manager's expression remained neutral. "We've received feedback from other clients who are uncomfortable with your presence. Given the recent events, we believe it's best if you shop elsewhere." Victoria stared at her in disbelief, the humiliation crushing. She turned and walked out, the eyes of other shoppers following her, their whispers sharp and cutting. She had become a pariah, and there was no escaping it. Richard faced similar treatment. He attempted to attend a business luncheon at a club where he had been a member for 20 years, only to be informed at the door that his membership had been revoked. The explanation was vague, citing conduct unbecoming of a member. But the message was clear. He was no longer welcome. Even Damien's sisters, who had once reveled in mocking Eleanor, found themselves on the receiving end of social judgment. They were uninvited from events, excluded from group chats, and confronted by acquaintances who asked pointed questions about their role in the abuse Eleanor had suffered. One sister, Caroline, broke down in tears during a confrontation at a friend's dinner party. "We didn't know she was a billionaire," she sobbed. "If we had known, we never would have treated her that way." The response from the woman confronting her was cold and unforgiving. "So you only treat people with respect if they have money? That's even worse, Caroline. You're not a victim here. You're part of the problem." The collapse of the Langston social standing was not just about exclusion. It was about the public recognition of their moral failures. Eleanor had not only reclaimed her assets, she had forced society to confront the ugliness of entitlement and cruelty, using her story as a mirror that reflected the values people claimed to hold versus the reality of how they treated others. Eleanor, meanwhile, continued to move through the world with grace and dignity. She attended charity events, not to flaunt her victory, but to support causes she believed in. She gave interviews where she spoke about resilience, justice, and the importance of standing up for oneself. She never mentioned the Langstons by name in these appearances, but she didn't need to. Everyone knew who she was talking about. At one event, a young woman approached Eleanor, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said quietly. "My family treated me the same way yours did. Watching you stand up for yourself gave me the courage to leave. You saved my life." Eleanor took the woman's hands, her voice gentle. "You saved your own life. I just showed you that it's possible. Never let anyone make you feel less than you are." The encounter was captured by a photographer and went viral, cementing Eleanor's status not just as a businesswoman or a wronged wife, but as a symbol of empowerment and justice. The Langstons, watching from the margins of a society that no longer wanted them, understood that their fall was complete. They had lost their wealth, their status, and their reputation. But more than that, they had lost the ability to control the narrative. Eleanor had taken that from them. And in doing so, she had ensured that their cruelty would be remembered, judged, and condemned by a public that now saw them for exactly what they were. As Victoria sat in her cramped apartment, scrolling through articles and social media posts that praised Eleanor and vilified her family, she realized something that made her chest tighten with a pain sharper than any she had felt before. Eleanor had won, not just legally or financially, but morally. And there was no coming back from that. The question that haunted the Langstons now was simple but devastating. How does a family rebuild when the entire world knows what they've done, and no one is willing to forgive? Between the public victories and the legal maneuvers, between the boardroom decisions and the calculated reclamation of everything stolen from her, Eleanor Whitmore experienced moments of profound stillness. These were the hours when the armor she wore so carefully slipped away, revealing the woman beneath, the one who had been broken, betrayed, and forced to rebuild herself from nothing. In her penthouse apartment, after the triplets had been fed and rocked to sleep, Eleanor would sit in the nursery, the soft glow of the nightlight casting shadows across the walls. She would watch her children breathe, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm, their faces peaceful and innocent. These were the moments when the weight of everything she had endured pressed down on her, when the memories she had pushed aside during the day came flooding back with brutal clarity. She thought about the wedding, how she had stood in that grand estate wearing a dress stained with wine, surrounded by people who saw her as a joke. She remembered the laughter, the way Victoria's eyes had gleamed with triumph, the way Damien had squeezed her hand under the table, but said nothing to defend her. That moment had been the first crack, the beginning of a pattern that would define the darkest period of her life. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the memory wash over her, not to torture herself, but to remind herself why she had fought so hard. The pain was real, but so was her strength. She had endured that humiliation, absorbed it, and turned it into fuel. She thought about the months that followed, the slow transformation of Damien from protector to stranger. She could still see him clearly, the way his face had hardened when he started listening to his mother, the way his eyes had lost their warmth. She remembered the first time he came home smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, the way he had walked past her without a word, as if she were invisible. The betrayal had cut deeper than any insult Victoria could throw, because Damien had been her hope. He had been the reason she believed love could conquer cruelty. But love, she had learned, was not enough when it was one-sided, when it was built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. Eleanor opened her eyes, focusing on her daughter's sleeping face. "I won't let anyone treat you the way they treated me," she whispered. "You'll grow up knowing your worth, knowing that no one has the right to diminish you." The promise felt sacred, a vow that extended beyond her own pain and into the future she was building for her children. The flashbacks came in waves, unbidden but necessary. Eleanor remembered the night she gave birth, the agony of labor compounded by the crushing loneliness of knowing Damien wasn't coming. She had called him, her voice trembling with pain and fear, and he had responded with indifference. She remembered the coldness in his tone, the way he had said he would call his mother, as if Eleanor's suffering was someone else's problem. That moment had shattered the last remnants of her hope, replacing it with a clarity that was both painful and liberating. She remembered Victoria standing in the hospital room, her face twisted with disdain as she looked at the triplets. 3 of them. How excessive. The words had been designed to wound, and they had succeeded. But they had also ignited something in Eleanor, a rage so cold and focused that it had become the foundation of her plan. She thought about the motel room, the dingy space where she had collapsed with her babies, her body broken, her heart shattered. She remembered sitting on the floor, sobbing until there were no tears left, feeling the full weight of abandonment. But even in that moment, even at her lowest point, her mind had been working. She had been planning, strategizing, refusing to let despair consume her completely. That night had been the turning point, the moment when Eleanor stopped being the victim and became the architect of her own justice. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights below. She thought about the power she now wielded, the empire she had built, and the way she had used it to dismantle the family that had tried to destroy her. But the victory felt complicated, layered with emotions she couldn't always name. There was satisfaction, yes, and a sense of justice served. But there was also grief, for the woman she had been before the Langstons, for the innocence she had lost, for the marriage she had believed in. She wondered sometimes if she had changed too much, if the hardness she had developed to survive would ever soften. Marcus had told her once that she had power and integrity, a rare combination. But Eleanor worried that the line between justice and vengeance was thinner than she wanted to admit. She never wanted to become like Victoria, cruel and vindictive, using power to hurt rather than to heal. That fear kept her grounded, reminded her to temper her actions with empathy, even when the Langstons deserved none. One evening, as Eleanor prepared dinner for herself, her phone rang. It was an unknown number, and she hesitated before answering. Hello. The voice on the other end was hesitant, fragile. Eleanor, it's Caroline. Eleanor froze, recognizing the name immediately. Caroline Langston, Damien's younger sister, one of the women who had whispered and sneered at her for months. What do you want, Caroline? Eleanor's tone was cold, guarded. Caroline's voice cracked. I wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything. The way we treated you. The things we said, I didn't realize how horrible we were. I didn't understand until it was too late. Eleanor's jaw tightened. You didn't understand because you didn't want to. You enjoyed making me feel small, Caroline. You and your sister both did. I know, Caroline whispered, tears evident in her voice. And I hate myself for it. I see now what we did, how cruel we were. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry. Eleanor closed her eyes, wrestling with the anger and pain that Caroline's voice stirred up. Part of her wanted to hang up, to refuse the apology, to let Caroline carry the weight of her guilt. But another part of her, the part that still believed in compassion, recognized the sincerity in the younger woman's voice. Caroline, your apology doesn't change what happened. It doesn't undo the pain your family caused. But I appreciate that you had the courage to call. There was a long pause. Are you going to be okay? Caroline asked quietly. Eleanor's voice was steady. I already am. Take care of yourself, Caroline. She ended the call, setting the phone down and taking a deep breath. The conversation had been unexpected, a small crack in the wall of hostility that had defined her relationship with the Langstons. It didn't change anything, but it reminded Eleanor that people were capable of growth, of recognizing their mistakes, even if it came too late to repair the damage. Later that night, Eleanor sat with her journal, a practice she had started during her time in the motel. Writing helped her process the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her, gave her a space to be vulnerable without judgment. She wrote about the gala, the moment she had stood on that stage and reclaimed her voice. She wrote about the look on Victoria's face, the shock and horror as the truth was revealed. She wrote about Damien's voicemail, the broken apology he had left, and the complicated mix of anger and pity it had stirred in her. I don't hate him, she wrote. I hate what he became, what he allowed himself to become. But the man I married, the one I fell in love with, he's gone. And mourning that loss feels necessary, even if I never want him back. She paused, her pen hovering over the page. I've won. Financially, socially, morally. But winning doesn't feel the way I thought it would. It's not triumphant or joyful. It's quiet, bittersweet, justice served, but at the cost of so much pain. Eleanor closed the journal and looked at the photo on her desk, a picture of her and the triplets taken just days ago. They were smiling, their tiny hands reaching toward the camera, their eyes bright with the innocence of children who had no idea what their mother had endured to protect them. That photo was her anchor, the reminder of why she had fought so hard, why she had refused to let the Langstons break her. The emotional oscillation Eleanor experienced between strength and vulnerability, between justice and grief, between power and compassion, was what made her story so compelling. She was not a one-dimensional character seeking revenge. She was a woman who had been forced to navigate the complexity of human emotion, to balance her need for justice with her desire to remain true to her values. And as she sat in the quiet of her home, surrounded by the life she had rebuilt, Eleanor understood that her journey was far from over. The Langstons had been dealt with, their empire dismantled, their cruelty exposed. But Eleanor's story was about more than them. It was about resilience, about the power of quiet strength, about the truth that no one, no matter how powerful or entitled, can destroy a woman who knows her worth. She thought about the future, about the foundation she would build, the scholarships she would fund, the young women she would mentor. She thought about the legacy she would leave for her children, a legacy not of wealth alone, but of integrity, courage, and the unshakable belief that justice, when pursued with wisdom and compassion, was the most powerful force in the world. As the city slept below and her children dreamed peacefully in the next room, Eleanor Whitmore allowed herself a moment of peace. She had survived. She had fought. She had won. And now finally she could begin to heal. 6 months had passed since the gala, since Eleanor had stood on that stage and reclaimed not just her empire, but her voice, her dignity, and her future. The world had moved on, as it always does, but the story of Eleanor Whitmore remained a cultural touchstone, a reminder of what happens when quiet strength meets calculated justice. Eleanor sat in her office at Whitmore Enterprises, the morning sun streaming through the windows, illuminating the space she had built with her own hands. On her desk sat architectural plans for a new project, one that had consumed her thoughts and energy for months. It was a foundation, not just another charitable organization, but something deeply personal, something that would ensure her story had meaning beyond revenge. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation for Women's Empowerment would provide scholarships, mentorship programs, and resources for young women from modest backgrounds, women who, like Eleanor, had been told they didn't belong, that they weren't good enough, that their dreams were too big. She wanted to give them what no one had given her, a support system, a community, and the tools to build their own empires without having to hide who they were. Marcus knocked on the door, entering with his usual warm smile. The board approved the foundation budget unanimously. We're fully funded for the next 5 years, and we've already received over 3,000 applications for the first scholarship cycle. Eleanor's eyes softened with emotion. 3,000. Marcus nodded. Your story resonated, Eleanor. Women everywhere see themselves in you. They see what's possible when you refuse to let anyone define your worth. Eleanor stood, walking to the window and looking out at the city below. I want this foundation to be more than just money, Marcus. I want it to be a place where women learn that their value isn't determined by their background, their family, or anyone else's opinion. I want them to know that quiet strength is real power. They'll learn that from you, Marcus said. You're the living proof. Eleanor turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. What about the Langstons? Have there been any updates? Marcus hesitated, then pulled out a file. Richard and Victoria are living in a 2-bedroom apartment across town. Richard tried to find work, but his reputation makes it difficult. Victoria hasn't been seen publicly in months. As for Damien, he's been consistent with child support payments, minimal as they are, and he's requested supervised visits with the triplets. Eleanor's jaw tightened slightly. And what does the report say about his behavior during those visits? Marcus flipped through the file. The supervisor notes that he's gentle with the children, attentive, and genuinely trying. He hasn't made any attempts to contact you directly, and he's followed every guideline to the letter. The supervisor's assessment is that he's different, quieter, more present. Eleanor absorbed this information, her emotions a complicated mix. She had spent months dismantling Damien's life, and part of her had expected him to fight back, to lash out, to prove that he was the same selfish man who had abandoned her. But instead, he had accepted the consequences, embraced his limited role, and focused on being the father he had never been. It didn't erase what he had done, but it suggested that maybe, just maybe, he was capable of change. Maintain the current arrangement, Eleanor said finally. He can continue supervised visits, but nothing more. The children deserve to know their father, but only if he proves he's worthy of that privilege. Marcus nodded. Understood. That evening, Eleanor returned to her penthouse, where her nanny, a kind woman named Grace, had the triplets ready for bed. Eleanor thanked her and took over, savoring the routine she had come to cherish. She bathed them one by one, their giggles filling the bathroom with a joy that healed something deep inside her. She dressed them in soft pajamas, read them stories and voices that made them laugh, and rocked each one to sleep, whispering promises of a future filled with love, security, and opportunity. As she placed the last baby in the crib, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching him sleep. These children, born into chaos and rejection, would grow up knowing only safety and love. They would never experience the humiliation she had endured, never doubt their worth, never question whether they belonged. That was her greatest victory, not the empire she had reclaimed, but the life she had built for them. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late, well past the time when anyone would visit unannounced. She walked to the door cautiously, checking the security monitor. Her breath caught when she saw who was standing there. Damien. He looked different, thinner, his clothes simple and worn, his face etched with exhaustion and something else, humility. Eleanor's first instinct was to ignore him, to let him stand there until he gave up and left. But curiosity, or perhaps a desire for closure, made her open the door. "What are you doing here, Damien?" she asked, her voice cold. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness that seemed genuine. "I know I'm not supposed to be here. I know you don't want to see me, but I needed to talk to you just once, face to face." Eleanor crossed her arms, standing in the doorway, refusing to let him inside. "You have 2 minutes." Damien took a shaky breath. "I've spent the last 6 months trying to understand how I became the person who hurt you. I've gone to therapy, Eleanor. Real therapy, not just to check a box, but because I needed to figure out what was broken inside me that let me treat you the way I did." Eleanor's expression remained guarded. "And what did you figure out?" "That I was weak," Damien said, his voice breaking. "I let my mother manipulate me because it was easier than standing up to her. I convinced myself that you were the problem because facing the truth, that I was the problem, was too painful. I became a coward, and I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me." Eleanor felt a flicker of something, not forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. "Why are you telling me this?" Damien's eyes met hers, and for the first time in months, she saw the man she had once loved, buried beneath the wreckage of everything he had become. "Because you deserved better. You deserved a husband who fought for you, who protected you, who loved you the way you deserved. And I failed. I failed you, I failed our children, and I failed myself. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Eleanor. I don't deserve it. I'm just asking you to know that I see what I did, and I'm trying to be better, not for you, but for them." Eleanor's chest tightened, the emotions she had kept carefully controlled threatening to surface. "Being better for them means staying in your lane, Damien. It means showing up for supervised visits, paying child support, and respecting the boundaries I've set. It doesn't mean coming to my home uninvited." Damien nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I understand. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." Eleanor watched him for a long moment, then stepped back and began to close the door. "Your apology doesn't change what happened. But if you truly want to be better, prove it with your actions, not your words. Be the father they need, even if you can never be the husband I deserved." She closed the door, leaning against it as Damien's footsteps faded down the hall. She felt a strange sense of peace, not because his apology had healed her wounds, but because it confirmed what she had always known. She didn't need his redemption to move forward. Her healing was her own, and it had nothing to do with him. Weeks later, the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation officially launched with a ceremony that brought together business leaders, philanthropists, and young women who would be the first recipients of the scholarships. Eleanor stood at the podium, her voice steady and powerful as she addressed the crowd. "This foundation exists because I know what it's like to be underestimated, to be told you don't belong, to have your worth questioned simply because of where you came from. But I also know what it's like to rise above that, to build something extraordinary, and to prove that your circumstances don't define you. your character does. Your determination does. Your refusal to accept anything less than what you deserve does. The audience erupted in applause, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. This was her legacy, not the destruction of a Langston's, but the creation of something that would outlive her, something that would change lives and empower generations of women to come. That night, as Eleanor sat in her living room, her triplets playing at her feet, she reflected on the journey she had taken. From the humiliated bride standing in a wine-stained dress, to the woman thrown into the cold with her newborn babies, to the CEO who had reclaimed her empire and dismantled those who had tried to destroy her. She had survived, fought, and won. But more than that, she had healed. She had forgiven herself for believing in people who didn't deserve her trust. She had forgiven Caroline for her cruelty, not because Caroline deserved it, but because holding on to anger would only weigh her down. And she had released Damien not from accountability, but from the space he had occupied in her heart. He was no longer her husband, her betrayer, or her burden. He was simply the father of her children, a man trying to rebuild himself, and that was enough. Eleanor looked at her children, their faces lit with joy as they played, and she smiled. "You'll never have to fight the battles I fought," she whispered. "But you'll know how because I'll teach you. You'll know your worth, your strength, and your power. And no one will ever make you doubt it." As the city lights twinkled outside her window and the future stretched before her, full of possibility and promise, Eleanor Whitmore understood that her story was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming her voice, her dignity, and her place in a world that had tried to silence her. And in doing so, she had become more than a billionaire, more than a CEO, more than a wronged wife. She had become a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope, and a reminder that quiet strength, when finally unleashed, can change everything. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us the part of the story you enjoyed most.